I want to call up my co-author to get him on the line and to get started. But before that, and I don't want to embarrass him, I'm going to read you his bio. Brad Feld has been an early-stage investor and entrepreneur since 1987. Prior to co-founding Foundry Group, he co-founded several other venture capital firms. He is also one of the co-founders of Techstars, the largest incubator and accelerator in the world. In addition to investing, he's been active with several not-for-profits. He's the chair of the National Women in Information and Technology, the co-chair of Startup Colorado. He's on the board of Startup Global. He has a bachelor's degree and a master's of science from the MIT. But let's put all that aside. If a venture capitalist should be judged by the returns, so I took $100 million and I returned $1 billion. If a venture capitalist should be judged by the quality of the investments, here's a little bit about Brad Feld. Anyone ever play Guitar Hero or have their kids play Guitar Hero? That's Brad's investment. Anyone ever wear a Fitbit? Brad's investment. Anyone ever use a 3D printer? Okay, let's try this differently. Anyone know what a 3D printer is? That's Brad, MakerBot. Okay? More than 500 investments in his portfolio. He has found more unicorns than anybody on Game of Thrones. Okay? This is a guy who stays humble and makes $250 million in a day off an investment 5 years ago. He's also made it his life goal to prove you don't have to be in Silicon Valley, that there are communities all over the world that you can tap into, and this is one of them. So without further ado, I'd like to call up my co-author, Mr. Brad Feld, to the line.
Hey there.
Well, hello, Brad. How are you today, Mr. Feld?
I'm doing fine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now perfectly. What you've missed...
I sound like a Verizon ad. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now? How about now? We're in a room with 300 fabulous entrepreneurs on the east coast of Canada. Brad is in Boulder, Colorado, getting ready for Denver Startup Week. He sends his regards. Brad, I've told him a little bit about you. I hope I haven't embarrassed you too much.
I recorded what you said and I sent it to my mom.
You know what? She also wrote my bio today. Not your mom, my mom. So as long as you keep your moms happy, you're happy.
That's
Brad,
right.
I want to talk to you about building a startup community. They've had a few exits in this part of the world, and they're looking to do more. They've just announced their goal for 2020 or 2019 to be 400 plus companies created and executed against, and the region's about 140,000 people, 150,000 people. So they're very interested in your thoughts around why you don't have to live in Silicon Valley to be part of a startup community. So let's start with that. What do you think, in your research, are the elements of a good startup community?
So for context, it's useful to realize that Boulder, Colorado, where I live, is about the same size. We're 100,000 people in Boulder. So the notion that you're 140, 150,000 people maps pretty nicely to what we look like. In a book I wrote in 2012 called Startup Communities, I defined 4 specific things that, and I call them the Boulder thesis, 4 specific principles that every startup community needs to have to build a great long-term startup community. So the first is that entrepreneurs have to be the leaders. I talk very extensively in the book about the notion of leaders and feeders, where entrepreneurs have to lead, and all the other constituents, government, big business, university, nonprofits, need to support the entrepreneurial activity rather than try to lead or control it. So thing one is that the entrepreneurs, you have to have a critical mass of them who are leaders. Second, you have to take a very long-term view, at least 20 years. Sean and I talk about this in Startup Opportunities. Some companies occur out of nowhere overnight, but the vast majority of companies take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to build into significant businesses. And that notion is true for startup communities as well. So I'm glad to hear you talking about 2019. I'd encourage you to think about 2035 and go on a much longer journey than just 4 or 5 years, and certainly a much longer journey than 1 or 2 years. The third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. This is super key. It doesn't matter whether they're an experienced entrepreneur or first-time entrepreneur, whether they grew up in your city or they moved to your city or they left your city. You're building a network of inclusiveness because you don't know where the next magic is going to come from, and you want people to engage with what you're doing. And then the last is you have to have continuous activities and events that actually engage people in entrepreneurship. So events like this are nice where, you have Sean and a gigantic head on a screen come talk to you. But you really need people who are doing entrepreneurship. So things like Startup Weekends, which is a 54-hour simulation of entrepreneurship, or accelerators like Techstars, where it's a 90-day intensive program where companies are getting created and mentors are surrounding them. These kinds of things are continuous in the need for your startup community. So if you do those 4 things, have a critical mass of entrepreneurs who are leaders, take a long-term view, are inclusive of everyone, and have continuous activities and events that engage people in entrepreneurship, over this long period of time, you create an incredible foundation for company creation and innovation in your community.
I think that's very good. Now, a lot of people still think Silicon Valley is the promised land, but Boulder has proven that smaller markets can have extra benefits. This is a smaller market. What sort of benefits should they be focusing on to stop people from fleeing down to the valley, to get the real sense of it?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd encourage everybody to do is to let go of this notion that there's a specific geography that matters, that is the promised land, or that's the place you have to be. And even if you want to just think about big city versus little city, the idea that Silicon Valley is a place doesn't really work anymore, right? Silicon Valley is much more than a single city. And in fact, the cultural norms between San Francisco and the peninsula are very different. And then even Oakland now, as another startup community, which is adjacent, is different. So you end up having different characteristics regardless of the concentration of the city. And then if you start thinking about just in the US, other big cities where there's enormous entrepreneurial activity, New York comes to mind immediately, Boston comes to mind, Seattle comes to mind, Austin, Texas comes to mind, Chicago.
Toronto.
Yeah, it's not in the United States, but it's close. It's in the northern United States, right? Sean told me when I was...
American of you.
I know. Sean told me when I was in Canada with him that in Canada you refer to the U.S. as Southern Canada. So I need to.
The U.S. is Canada's pants.
There you go, Canada's pants. If you're in a city, the first thing you should do is think about what's magic about your city. Every city exists as an entrepreneurial endeavor. Some group of people decided to create a city where every city is. There's an origin story. And I don't know the origin story of your city, but I certainly know that there is an origin story. Every city, typically given, the age of most cities in North America, 100, 200, 300 years old, the origin of modern cities, the origin story typically is built on some natural resources, physical natural resources. But in 2015, the origin story starting today is built on a bunch of different resources, some natural, physical, some intellectual, some cultural. So there's something special about each city in the world. So you start with that. What's magic and special about your city? And then build around that, rather than try to emulate something else. So in Boulder, we don't try to emulate the Bay Area. If anything, many people that come to Boulder from the Bay Area are coming here because they want to get away from the Bay Area. They want to be involved in a very different kind of city that still has an extremely vibrant startup community and innovation culture. So start from that frame of reference.
As part of the Boulder thesis, you talked a lot about entrepreneurs leading, but they're only one sort of leg of that stool. What's the role of the other 2 legs? What's the role of government in the startup ecosystem? What's the role of the not-for-profit universities? How do they contribute to this overall ecosystem in your mind?
So there's a fundamental conceptual thing that you have to start with when you separate between entrepreneurs and the way entrepreneurs behave and interact with things in their companies and institutions like government or universities. And it's really the notion of the difference between a network and a hierarchy. And it's not judgment. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just that they're fundamentally different, and you have to recognize the differences. So hierarchies have been around forever, right? Religion is fundamentally a hierarchy. Military is a hierarchy. Government's a hierarchy. Big businesses are built on hierarchies. And the notion of a hierarchy is that the way you gain power is that you adhere to the norms of the hierarchy and you move up the curve, up the ladder in the hierarchy. And you either do that by doing an exemplary job or undermining the person above you in the hierarchy. And either of those are successful strategies, but fundamentally power is accrued as you travel up a hierarchy. In a network, the network is just this messy connection of people. And your power in the network is a function of the size of your node as an individual. We're each nodes on this network. And if we talked about networks 30 years ago as an intellectual construct, today, we understand networks because of social networks, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. It's not the number of people you follow or the number of people that follow you or the number of people that are connected to you or you're connected to. It's the activity across the number of connections that you have. So if you're part of a network and you have very, very few connections, even if you have huge amounts of activity across those connections, you're not going to be a very big node on the network. If you've got thousands and thousands of connections on the network, but there's no activity across it, you don't do anything, you're going to be a very small node. So really the power that you accrue in a network model is the number of connections you have times the amount of activity. So if you think about those two constructs, if you're a member of one of the hierarchies or one of the feeders, a university or government, you have a job, and your job is defined in your hierarchical norm, and you make progress by executing your job. If you're a founder of a company, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't really have a clearly defined job, and what you're trying to do is exist within this very complex and vibrant network that you're creating as you try to build your business. A startup community is fundamentally a network. And so as a member of government or as a member of university or big business that supports entrepreneurship or a nonprofit that supports entrepreneurship or a service provider, whether you're an accounting firm or a law firm or a venture firm, investment firm, you're trying to become a node on the network of the startup community and engage with the startup community while bringing the resources and the power of your hierarchy to the support of the startup community. The mistake is when you try to control the startup community. So I see this in lots and lots of cities where the university system, for example, shows up and tries to be the center of all entrepreneurial activity in a city. That doesn't work. You try to turn a network into hierarchy. Another example is that government shows up and says, we're going to build a really strong entrepreneurial community here. And government starts to try to organize what's going on in the startup community. That doesn't work. What you want to do is you want to stay in your organization. You're trying to accomplish what your goals are as a hierarchical organization, but you want to do it by attaching to and engaging with the network rather than trying to control it.
So let's go from strategic to tactical. So what is an example of how the Boulder government, whether it be Colorado or whether it be the municipal level, did right in participating in fueling the fire that the entrepreneurs started up?
Sure.
Did they host parties? Did they sponsor events? Did they bring in big, good-looking speakers?
Yeah, yes to all of those things. And an example of the power of it could be, we could use Denver Startup Week, which is next week, as an example. Denver Startup Week is a program that's run by an organization called Startup Week, now owned by Techstars. Techstars bought the parent organization Up Global a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago. Startup Weeks are now happening all across the world. There'll probably be about 50 or 60 of them this year. And Denver city government and Colorado state government are very involved in Denver Startup Week as a way of creating more visibility to the broad extended local city. Denver's a 2 million person city around what's happening in the startup community. So there's lots of visibility, the power of government as a convener, the ability of government to help people understand the priorities of the city so different organizations can focus on their priorities. And from that comes some interesting things. So for example, there's a bunch of nonprofit organizations in Colorado that support entrepreneurship. Let's say there's, I don't know, 20 of them, making up a number. The government, the city of Denver, had an old building that was unused. They donated that building to the nonprofits and created an organization or a facility called Commons on Champa. And Commons on Champa now houses all of the nonprofit organizations supporting entrepreneurship, including members from city government to help support entrepreneurship throughout Colorado. So things like the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network of Colorado, things like the Colorado Technology Association are all housed in this building that it was an empty government building. So there's lots of ways from an infrastructure, an advocacy, and a visibility perspective that government can help support the activity of the startup community.
That's very helpful. Tonight is demo day for the local accelerator, which covers a number of provinces here. They all team up, and it's going to be very exciting. One of the ways that you have to measure success, or that success sometimes is measured, is by follow-on funding. So we don't have an exit yet. The companies are still very young. They've been funded by seed money or local angels. And now they're going to get ready for the next step. They want to raise a larger pool of capital. They want to get someone from outside of the city in. Do you think follow-on funding is the right metric? And if so, how should you maximize that metric as a small community?
So I think that follow-on funding is a early leading metric. So what you have to realize is that it's very, very hard to quantify how you're doing in a very short period of time around the development of a startup community. This is one of the challenges, I think, of a lot of institutional activity around entrepreneurship. Right? If you are, say, a government agency and you're investing some of your time and resource and potentially money in the startup community, you want to see what kind of return you're getting. And so you start looking for metrics to help measure that. The problem is, coming back to this 20-year view, it doesn't happen in a year or two. It happens over a long period of time. So when you think about companies coming out of an accelerator, the funding is a very good short-term metric, but it almost has no real correlation between the long-term success and health of the startup community. More importantly, funding is not a success characteristic for a company. It's just a step along the way to give the company more fuel to continue to move forward. So if you look at, for example, and I'll use Techstars because we have very, very long history now, we open source all the Techstars data. You can look at every single Techstars company, every Techstars program and every Techstars company going back to the first program in Boston in 2007 on the Techstars website and see how much money they raised, how many employees they have, whether they're still in business or not, and whether they went out of business or were acquired. Well, 8 years later, we're starting to have some interesting data, but it takes a long time. So I would make sure that you segment that short-term metric and the success or lack of you feel, and recognize that what you're doing is you are playing this long-term game, and those companies don't need to just raise money, but they need to then go build real businesses. And when they start building real businesses, that's when interesting things will start to happen.
So you sort of flag this need for a long-term view, but the difficulty with that can sometimes be the short-term political landscape. I couldn't help but notice that you guys are getting ready for an election. There seems to be some hubbub on different sides of the aisle. We have an election underway here too. But in general, politicians do short-term gains so they can get reelected. So how have you been able to get the governor on side, the mayor on side, the White House? I can't help but notice that Techstars had a demo day at the White House. How have you been able to get them past that when they're already looking at the next election?
I think there's two issues. One is it's less an issue of trying to get them and quote them around government involved. And it's much more about just doing interesting and important things and having government, whoever the current incumbent government infrastructure is, say, hey, we want to be more involved and we want to help. So I think a mistake a lot of people make when they approach government is that they have a specific agenda and a specific set of things they want to get out of government. If you're a founder of a company, that's a bad approach, right? If you're a founder of a company, you want to make the best possible product for your customers. You want to be obsessed around the product and the product that you're working on and building and the relationship you have with your customers. And the last thing in the world you want to do is depend on government or somebody who wants to be in political office to help you make your business successful. If you're driving forward on success and you're helping whoever is, currently in office with the agenda they have around entrepreneurship, you'll build a nice feedback loop. So in Colorado, we have a governor, John Hickenlooper, who was an entrepreneur. He was one of the founders of the craft brewing industry, and I think he founded the very first brew pub possibly in North America. I don't know whether it's
beer.
Fair to say the world, but certainly in North America. And we have a very strong senator in Colorado, Michael Bennett, who worked in private equity for Phil Anschutz, who's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Colorado and in the United States. And so they both understood entrepreneurship and business. We also have somebody in the House, Jared Polis, who's a two-time entrepreneur. Jared's built two companies, the first that got bought for about $800 million by Excite, and the second which went public and then got bought by Liberty Media for about $500 million. So, you have some people in government who were entrepreneurs and understand entrepreneurship. They're very interested in moving that forward. So helping those people with their specific agenda by providing content, resources, et cetera, then creates a feedback loop where they start focusing more on what's going on. That's how I think you effectively engage government.
I think that's a great answer. I want to change topics a little bit now. You've discovered, funded, and grown more billion-dollar startups than most investors I know in recent history.
Anyone on Game of Thrones. I heard that. I think that's a good metric.
So you were listening in, okay. Yeah, you did. You're the mother of dragons. You have, a dragon is like a really rich unicorn. What do you think when you look back at all of these companies, the Fitbits, the MakerBots, even the Zyngas, the Guitar Heroes? What's the common thread?
Well, for me, across those companies, it was a set of founders who were completely and totally obsessed with what they were building. And if you go through those four companies specifically, in the case of Fitbit, James Park and Eric Friedman, who co-founded Fitbit and still run it today, the thing that they were put on this planet Earth to build was the product set that Fitbit has created. And that evolved from two people that were just tinkering into now, a very significant company. The Harmonix founders, Alex Rogopoulos and Arana Gozzi, started in 1995 with the idea of creating computer software for music. They were both musicians. They were both MIT graduate students, and they were both computer scientists. And they were obsessed about music and obsessed about computers. And as a company, Harmonix literally tried to go out of business every year for 10 years. And they somehow managed not to go out of business. Every year they had something happen. They sold a new game, or they made enough revenue, or they raised a little bit of money. And a decade after they started down this mission that they were obsessed about, they came out with Guitar Hero. And Guitar Hero was one of these classic overnight successes, but it, of course, took a decade to get there. MakerBot, Bree Pettis and his co-founders were completely obsessed with the idea of 3D printing and that everybody in the world should have a 3D printer on their desktop. The idea that a 3D printer cost $50,000 or $100,000 and took up a room was anathema to them. And so they were obsessed about the product. So the list goes on, and it's this complete focus at the very beginning of the journey on what you're doing as a product, and then that continual evolution throughout your journey and maintaining that obsession. I don't know any great entrepreneurs that I work with who are like, yeah, I don't really care about the product I build, whatever, it's just a thing, I'm just building a business. They're really focused on what it is they're creating.
I think that's really good. I know we're going to open it up to questions in a moment, but I wanted to just get your perspective, because you and I have been investing in coming up on 20 years. So you've been quoted many times that you hate business plans.
I actually wrote a business plan that was a document, a well-structured one, probably 50, 60 pages, defining what we were going to do, how it was going to work, what the market opportunity was, who the competitors were, and what the financial model for the next 5 years was, before we actually started doing anything. And I don't know how much time I spent on that, but it was a lot. Today, that notion, that plan, when I look back at that business plan, I still have a copy of that business plan. It's really a meaningless plan. It's a meaningless document. It had nothing to do with where the business went. It had some ideas in it, but those ideas were obsolete as soon as the laser printer printed out the sheets of paper that the plan was written on. I have the original Harmonix business plan from 1994. This is the Guitar Hero rock band team. And, you know, it's awesome to read through the business plan. It's just a great work of fiction. It has nothing to do with the business they created. But it has a lot of sort of the basic beginning ideas. And I think that's the essence of it. What you want is you want to put some ideas down, but you don't want to spend a lot of time fleshing those ideas out. You want to start with a premise or a hypothesis, and you want to iterate very, very quickly. Now, the tools that we have today, you know, whether they're disciplined entrepreneurship by Allet or, you know, lean startup, you know, from Reese, or customer development from Steve Blank, those are frameworks that give you an easy way to quickly put the ideas down and then start running the experiments. So the frameworks that we have today and the approaches, it's not the absence of the planning process, but it's this disconnect from when you used to sit down and write out this long plan.
Wordsmith it, get all the grammar right.
Yeah, and the presentation of the plan mattered, to now being in a place where really what matters is what you're doing. And the plan and the planning helps give you a framework for doing, but then the doing is what actually matters.
Thanks. I'm going to open it up to the floor. And I think the first question, to encourage it, they're going to give them a copy of our book. So they have the book. We're going to wait for a hand to go up, and we're going to see who doesn't want to spend $24.99. Available on Amazon, soon to be an audio book. Buy multiple copies. It's a great Christmas, Hanukkah, or Kwanzaa gift. First question is yours, sir.
Can you guys speak to maybe, once the startup ecosystem is in place, what support should be required for companies that are looking to scale afterwards?
So we talked a little bit about how a startup evolves, and a startup is a startup until it has its business model nailed and it's worked it out. When it comes down to scale, there's a lot of different things that you have to do. There's a great course coming out of Stanford from the founder of LinkedIn called Blitz Scaling, or Blitz Scaling. And that's what it talks about. Now that you have your business model, how do you add to it? But let me ask my colleague in in Boulder, Brad, when these companies have nailed their business model, when they actually know how to get a customer, what they buy, the lifetime value, what are sort of the next tasks other than adding a poop load of money?
Well, it varies a lot by business. And one of the mistakes I think a lot of founders make is that they think there's a generic path from, wow, this works. Okay, now let's just raise a bunch of money and all will be good. Pretty much every company I've been involved in that's been extremely successful has had at least one, and in some cases multiple, near-death experiences as it was scaling the business. And those near-death experiences come from lots and lots of different places. You have huge challenges in terms of scaling your team. Most teams that are founding teams are not necessarily the same teams of companies when that company is 1,000 people. Now, the founders might still be there, the CEO might still be the CEO, but many of the people in your leadership roles will not be able to scale with the business. Another example would be the unit economics of your business. A lot of companies get a product that customers want, but don't get the unit economics right. And they assume that if they just sell more of it, things will work. Well, if you have a high margin business, software as a service business, or a technology business where you're selling literally software, you typically have very high gross margins. And so you have a lot of flexibility and leverage. But if you have a low margin business, let's say you're a web advertising business and you're actually selling web advertising but only taking 10 or 15% of it, or you're a transactional business and you're only taking a couple of percent of the revenue dollar, just scaling the revenue doesn't necessarily get you there. You have to understand deeper into the business and how to then build unit economics at scale. Another thing that companies miss, and that Reid Hoffman, who's the executive chairman of LinkedIn and the founder and largest shareholder in LinkedIn, who's putting this course together, will talk about, is the idea that Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger have been talking about forever, which is building a giant moat around your business. Understanding what your defensibility is as you scale your business, and then making sure you have an extraordinary moat around your business. LinkedIn's done an incredible job of that. And really what they've done is they've transferred the margin from the traditional recruiting business to LinkedIn, and subsequently built more and more defensibility around their business through the network they've created. So it's more than just apply cash, and at each different level of the business, you're going to have structural and strategic issues that you're going to have to understand.
Things like understanding your unit economics, things like understanding the cost of client acquisition, things like scaling, hiring new staff. Okay.
Yep.
Do we have another question here? Without a book? He's still going to ask. Okay.
Sure.
Oh, wait, they're going to give him a book anyway. Go ahead.
Hello. Okay. I hear what you said about the business plan, and I know if when you're venture capital, you'll go, like you say, you evaluate how you're going to invest in a company. But when you're presenting your project to a bank or even some government programs, they're more accountable to who they're going to provide or lend money. It's a little bit different. How do you differentiate?
So I'm going to start on that one because I have a lot of local context. So first and foremost, I'm very proud to say that the Ontario government no longer requires business plans. So they're actually accepting business canvases. So I run a little fund compared to Brad, and we're in Toronto, and all of them want this sort of matching funds that are available. And they wanted these 50-page plans 5 years ago, and so we just didn't bother applying. I'm not going to spend 500 hours to raise $25,000. They've switched to this canvas because they've accepted the fact that other than having more words, it's just as credible. It doesn't, you're still looking into the matter. So I think that's going to start trickling out. I think you're going to start to see more and more people learning that lean startup isn't just for Boulder-based companies. It can be used at a government level. It can be used at a banking level. I understand what you're saying, though. That bank wants to have a folder that they can point to when you go out of business to say, well, I had a business plan. But when they start to think past that, what is the real value other than covering their ass? So if it's not providing value, why are you doing it? Brad, have you seen any more forward-thinking groups in the Americas at a banking level or a government level that have evolved past the business plan and have sort of caught up with the idea of a lean canvas or a business model canvas?
Yeah, well, frankly, in the U.S., I don't know any bank that requires a business plan, that we deal with, that requires a business plan for lending. Silicon Valley Bank, Square One Bank, they don't ask for a business plan. I think that you should separate these two constructs, and I think Sean did it really well. If you have an organization that has a requirement of something for them to fund, you have to satisfy their requirement. That doesn't necessarily mean they're either a good source of funding for you, or it doesn't mean that you should say to them, no, we won't do that because we want your money. If they have a requirement, you have to satisfy the requirement. I would separate that from their, quote, accountability or their level of functional responsibility or effective efficacy as an investor. So the idea that because a bank requires a business plan, somehow they have more accountability, I don't buy that. I would buy the argument that structurally they're slower to adapt to the type of business that you're trying to create. And the question is either satisfy their needness of a plan or go look for another investor who doesn't need that, and at the same time recognize the difference between what you're doing to satisfy their need for material for them to invest in you from how you're actually going to execute your business. So if their requirement is you need a business plan, write the business plan, but still recognize that the business plan is a work of fiction. And if they want to work a fiction to underwrite your loan because that's part of their requirements, write a good business plan. But recognize that that business plan is not the tool that you should necessarily use to execute the planning of your business.
And I think that's key. Neither Brad nor myself are suggesting you don't do the planning. You don't do the thinking. You don't ask the 100 questions to yourself that a business plan would normally try to answer. I think what we're saying is twofold. One, don't actually think you can know the answer in advance. If you actually had that superpower, there's better ways to make money. But you don't know, so why hold it out as if you had the answers? And two, you have to justify the resource constraint, the fact that it's going to be hundreds of hours to get the font right and the format and the grammar. What's more important is the questions beneath the plan. Where do you get your customers? What are your channels? And there are other tools to do that. I think we have time for one more before we have to call up.
Yeah, just one more.
And give our thanks to our sponsors. We have time for one more, and in addition to a book, I'm going to throw in some gold coins that are really just chocolate.
Yeah, Brad, you started mentioning that entrepreneurs had to be available. Have you actually seen a community that took a civic administration, created a civic bank, used a credit union, used some manner in which to aggregate funds for these startups, because angel investors in this particular area are not that prevalent. They are here and they're in this room. But can a municipality, such as the one represented by 3Plus today, what can they do to create the culture of support?
Well, almost by definition, they can provide support in the same way that individual angels or collections of angels can provide support. So I wouldn't worry about or overthink the financing dynamic. In other words, wherever the financing is going to come from, it's going to come from. I would challenge the notion that there aren't very many angel investors in your community. If you go back to Boulder 20 years ago, I think you could say the same thing. There weren't a lot of angel investors in Boulder. But there were plenty of people who were wealthy, plenty of people who had lots of money, plenty of people who philanthropically gave money to support lots of different things. And when they start thinking about supporting long-term their local ecosystem and the innovation dynamics of their local ecosystem, one of the arguments for angel investors is it's for-profit philanthropy, right? Your worst case is you lose your money and you take your tax write-off. Your best case is you actually make some money. So if you believe in the long-term health of your city as an individual that has resources, participating as an angel investor in the local ecosystem around innovation, new company creation, in a lot of ways is as or more powerful than contributing money to your local symphony. So it's really a thing that is useful to broaden the lens over a long period of time. And it's the responsibility of the entrepreneurs and the institutions supporting entrepreneurs to help educate the wealthy people in the community about the importance of innovation and company creation for the long-term health of your city.
Now, one of the importances that I have to keep track of is time, and we are at the end of our session, so I'm going to turn to the audience and ask you to all at once give a big Moncton goodbye to Brad Feld. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, bye, Brad. Bye, Brad. 1, 2, 3, bye. Thank you. We'll speak to you soon.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for bringing me in. Uh-oh. I guess we're out of time. Thank you. Good night. I want to thank you very much for allowing me to come and share what little wisdom I've gathered over the years. It was a pleasure to talk to Brad as always, and I hope you added a little bit of value.